There's a question that lingers in late-night searches, whispered conversations, and the hidden corners of the internet. It's the kind of question people are embarrassed to voice out loud, even to close friends or doctors. A question that has been tangled up in fear, morality, and half-truths for centuries. What really happens to your body specifically, your prostate, if you masturbate every single day? From the shadows of history to the glowing screens of modern forums, myths have piled up around this act. Some whisper it's dangerous, that it drains your vitality, inflames your body, even shortens your life. Others say it's harmless, natural, and perhaps even protective. But the fear-mongering has always spoken louder, leaving men unsure of whether they are safeguarding their health or secretly harming it. It's not just a medical question, it's a deeply human one, woven into our collective anxiety about masculinity, aging, and mortality. The prostate, this small, walnut-sized gland, hidden beneath the bladder, has long been a source of mystery and dread. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, moral guardians painted masturbation as a sin that would ruin not just the soul but also the body. Doctors in Victorian England even warned parents that self-pleasure could lead to insanity or early death. Ideas that spread through pamphlets, sermons, and hushed warnings. These old cultural echoes still shape the modern imagination. Even today, in an era of science and open discussion, many men quietly worry. Could frequent release somehow wear out the prostate? Could too much pleasure invite disease, especially the one they fear most, prostate cancer? It's not surprising. Prostate cancer is among the most common cancers in men worldwide, second only to skin cancer in some regions. Every man knows someone, an uncle, a father, a neighbor who has been touched by it. And when the stakes are life and death, rumors gain power. The internet, with its mix of medical advice, anecdotal confessions, and outright fear-mongering, has only added fuel to this confusion. For decades, most of these fears went unchallenged. They were brushed off as folklore, or worse, accepted as cautionary truths meant to control behavior. Men grew up under the shadow of shame, never really questioning whether the science supported these claims. But science has a way of shattering silence. When researchers finally decided to test these old myths, what they found did more than just answer a question, it turned the conversation upside down. Because the truth, uncovered by some of the most rigorous studies in medical history, is genuinely shocking. And almost certainly not what generations of men were led to believe. That is the journey we are about to take, from fear to fact, from stigma to science, uncovering what daily masturbation really does to the prostate. To understand the truth behind the myths, we need to meet the quiet actor at the center of this entire story, the prostate. At first glance, it doesn't seem like much. Roughly the size of a walnut, weighing only about 20 grams, tucked discreetly beneath the bladder and in front of the rectum. It's an organ you never see, never feel, and for most of life, rarely even think about. And yet, this small gland plays a role far greater than its size suggests. Its primary job is deceptively simple, producing the fluid that nourishes and protects sperm, what we call semen. This fluid is alkaline, designed to counter the acidity of the female reproductive tract, giving sperm the best possible chance at survival. Without the prostate's contribution, human reproduction would become far more fragile. In other words, nature placed enormous responsibility into this tiny gland. But the prostate isn't just about reproduction. It sits at a crossroads of the male body, touching on urinary function, sexual health, and overall well-being. As men age, the prostate often becomes both a source of inconvenience and anxiety. Enlargement, known as benign prostatic hyperplasia, makes urination difficult. Inflammation, called prostatitis, causes pain and discomfort. And looming over all of it, the specter of prostate cancer. It's ironic. For much of a man's youth, the prostate is invisible, silent, a backstage worker in the grand play of life. But as the decades pass, it demands attention. Suddenly, it's no longer hidden. It becomes the subject of doctors' visits, tests, and whispered conversations. Historically, the prostate was shrouded in mystery. Ancient physicians didn't even fully understand its function. In medieval Europe, men suffering from urinary troubles were often thought to be cursed or suffering divine punishment. By the Enlightenment, the prostate began appearing in anatomical drawings, but even then, myths far outpaced medical truth. Some 19th-century doctors insisted that excessive sexual activity would weaken the gland permanently, while others argued that abstinence would lead to congestion and disease. The prostate became a battlefield for moral ideologies disguised as medical advice. And that moral dimension mattered. In many cultures, discussions of male sexuality were censored, wrapped in shame. This silence gave myths free rein. If something went wrong, if a man struggled with urination, impotence, or illness, he might secretly blame himself for overuse of his body, never knowing whether the science supported such fears. Even today, the prostate carries an aura of vulnerability. Unlike the heart, which we celebrate as a symbol of love and strength, or the brain, which we honor as the seat of intelligence, the prostate lives in the shadows. It is not celebrated. It is feared. And that fear is amplified by its association with cancer. But here is where curiosity becomes essential. To break free of myths, we must treat the prostate not as a symbol of shame, but as an organ deserving of understanding. The more we learn about its functions, its weaknesses, its strengths, the more we can protect it. And sometimes, what we learn doesn't just surprise us. It rewrites everything we thought we knew. For centuries, whispers about the dangers of self-pleasure have circulated through societies like ghost stories. In locker rooms, in online forums, in hushed late-night conversations. The warnings sound familiar. Masturbating too often will wear out the prostate. It will inflame the body, drain your strength, maybe even spark the terrifying disease no man wants to face: prostate cancer. These myths don't appear out of thin air. They have roots, tangled in morality, religion, and fear of the unknown. In ancient times, semen was often considered a sacred essence. Greek philosophers like Aristotle described it as a vital spirit, a concentration of energy drawn from the blood. To waste it was seen as reckless, almost sinful. Similar ideas appeared across cultures. In some Eastern traditions, frequent ejaculation was believed to deplete life force, or ki. Fast forward to the Victorian era, where anxieties about sexuality grew into a kind of moral panic. Pamphlets warned parents that boys who touched themselves would grow weak, sick, or even lose their sanity. Entire medical handbooks were devoted to diagnosing and curing so-called self-abuse. Devices were invented to prevent masturbation during sleep, ranging from spiked rings to crude belts. While shocking to us today, these inventions were widely advertised as legitimate medical products. Behind them lay a deep conviction that sexual pleasure outside of marriage was not only immoral but physically destructive. By the 20th century, as science advanced, these myths should have disappeared. And yet, they persisted, only reshaped. In the mid-1900s, men were warned that too much release would enlarge the prostate unnaturally. Later, with prostate cancer becoming one of the most common male cancers, the fears fused into something more concrete. Maybe frequent ejaculation wasn't just a moral failing, but a medical risk. The rise of the internet in the 1990s and early 2000s only spread these anxieties further. Online forums filled with speculation. Stories of men who claimed their health collapsed after too much self-pleasure, or others who swore abstinence healed them. Without clear scientific answers, these communities became echo chambers of worry, passing myths along like hand-me-down clothing. And beneath all of it, one truth remained. Men carried the burden of silence. Many didn't ask their doctors. Many didn't speak to friends. The myths lived on in private, untested by science, yet powerful enough to shape how millions thought about their own bodies. But silence never lasts forever. Eventually, science steps in. And when researchers began to test these myths rigorously test them, the results didn't just poke holes in old beliefs. They shattered them. When men whisper about the dangers of masturbation, the deepest fear at the core of it all is rarely spoken aloud. Cancer, prostate cancer. This disease is one of the most common cancers in men, affecting millions worldwide. In the United States alone, roughly 1 in 8 men will be diagnosed during their lifetime. In some families, the odds are even worse. Genetics can make it an inherited shadow that looms over every generation. It is a disease that quietly grows, often without symptoms, until it reaches advanced stages. That silence makes it especially frightening. For decades, prostate cancer carried with it not just medical weight, but cultural stigma. Men often avoided talking about urinary issues or sexual health with their doctors, even when warning signs appeared. The thought of cancer in such a private part of the body was terrifying because it was not only about survival, but about identity. Prostate surgery or radiation could affect sexual function, continence, the very things tied to masculinity. And so, silence reigned. Into that silence, myths found fertile ground. If a man developed prostate cancer, neighbors, or even his own thoughts might whisper. Perhaps he brought this upon himself. Perhaps it was because of too much indulgence, too much release. It's the same cruel logic humanity has applied to countless illnesses in history, blaming the patient for what fate or biology delivered. Even medical history has its missteps. Early in the 20th century, some physicians believed that frequent sexual activity could overstimulate the gland, making it vulnerable to disease. Others speculated the opposite, that abstinence caused stagnation and illness. Confusion reigned because real data was scarce. In absence of proof, fear thrived. But here's the paradox. The very organ that society taught men to fear using too much is the same one that quietly depends on healthy activity for its maintenance. The prostate, unlike many organs, is dynamic. It produces secretions that must move, must be released. When left to stagnate, those fluids, and the old cells that line its ducts, may contribute to inflammation or cellular stress. Ironically, the very thing men feared might harm them, ejaculation, was the same thing that might actually help. Still, until the late 20th century, this was speculation at best. Men lived with anxiety, sometimes quietly suffering symptoms, sometimes avoiding intimacy, sometimes hiding behind jokes. And in that cultural shadow, prostate cancer became not just a disease, but a specter, silent punishment waiting to strike. That is, until researchers decided to do something radical. Stop guessing, and start measuring. Instead of letting myths dominate, they followed tens of thousands of men for decades to find the truth. And what they uncovered was not just a surprise, it was a revelation. By the late 20th century, medicine had advanced far beyond the days of superstition and whispered warnings. Antibiotics had conquered infections, that once decimated populations. Vaccines had saved millions of lives, and imaging technology was illuminating the hidden interiors of the human body. But when it came to the prostate, one question remained maddeningly unresolved. Did frequent ejaculation harm or help this vulnerable organ? For years, doctors had little more than opinions to offer. Some cautioned restraint, others encouraged regular activity. But the truth was that no one had ever followed enough men for long enough to know. To break the stalemate, something more ambitious was required: research on a scale large enough to silence the rumors once and for all. That ambition took root at one of the world's most respected institutions, Harvard University. Specifically the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, known for its rigorous methodology and long-term health studies. The school had already shaped global understanding of diet, heart disease, and cancer. Now, they turned their gaze toward the prostate. It wasn't a small project. They recruited nearly 32,000 men, a cohort so vast it could reveal patterns invisible in smaller samples. These men were tracked, not for a few months, or even a few years, but for almost 2 decades. Every detail of their lives was documented: diet, exercise, medical history, and, crucially, their sexual habits. And here was the bold part. Among the data points, researchers asked men to report their ejaculation frequency, not just occasionally, but consistently, over years. It was a question that might have felt awkward, maybe even intrusive, but it was essential. Without it, the myths would remain untouched, protected by the silence men had carried for centuries. As the years rolled on, the study grew into something monumental. Medical journals occasionally mentioned it, but few outside the research world paid attention. After all, it was just data gathering until the analysis came in. What the Harvard team discovered would not only challenge old beliefs, it would dismantle them completely. The results were so clear, so striking, that they forced both the medical community and the public to look at the prostate in a new way. The myths, the warnings, the fears, suddenly, they were on trial. And the evidence that was about to surface would deliver the verdict. Imagine following tens of thousands of men across nearly 2 decades, recording their lives in painstaking detail, watching for the illnesses that might emerge, and tracing patterns invisible to the naked eye. That was the task Harvard researchers set for themselves in the 1990s. The project was part of what's known as a prospective cohort study. Rather than asking men to recall their past with imperfect memory, the scientists tracked them forward in time. They began with men who were cancer-free, collected information on their health and lifestyle, and then waited. Each year, more surveys, more updates, more medical records. The goal was simple but profound: to see which habits were linked to which outcomes, and to do so with the statistical power that only massive numbers can provide. Among the thousands of questions asked, one stood out for its boldness. How often do you ejaculate in a typical month? It might have seemed almost trivial compared to questions about diet or exercise. But to the researchers, it was a crucial variable, one that could either validate or destroy centuries of speculation. The participants ranged in age, background, and lifestyle. Some were young professionals just beginning families. Others were middle-aged men balancing careers with health concerns. And still others were older, carrying the quiet anxieties of aging. Together, they formed one of the most comprehensive portraits of male health ever assembled. And then came the waiting game. Cancer is not a disease that appears overnight. It creeps, sometimes taking decades to manifest. That's why this study's length, nearly 20 years, was its greatest strength. The researchers could watch as men aged, as their bodies changed, as illnesses emerged, and link those outcomes back to earlier habits. For nearly 2 decades, the data accumulated like sand in an hourglass. Thousands of medical charts, tens of thousands of questionnaires. Patterns that at first seemed random slowly began to take shape. By the time the study ended, the researchers weren't just holding a collection of numbers. They were holding a mirror to the truths and lies that men had lived under for generations. And in that mirror, the reflection was shocking. The prostate, it seemed, had a secret one that only such a massive study could reveal. When the analysis finally arrived, it stunned even the researchers. After nearly 2 decades of tracking, after sorting through mountains of surveys and medical files, the verdict was clear. Men who ejaculated more often, specifically those who did so at least 21 times per month, had a dramatically lower risk of developing prostate cancer compared to those who ejaculated less frequently. The reduction wasn't small. It was measurable, undeniable, and statistically significant. The men with the highest frequency had about a 33% lower risk of prostate cancer. In other words, far from being dangerous, ejaculation was protective. What centuries of whispers had painted as harmful, modern science revealed as healing. The implications were profound. For generations, men had been warned that too much sexual activity would drain them, weaken them, even kill them. Yet here was the data, from 32,000 men and 20 years of observation, showing the opposite. The body benefited from release. The act of clearing the prostate regularly seemed to flush out toxins, reduce inflammation, and maintain healthier tissue. When the study was published in the journal European Urology, it rippled through the medical community and the public alike. Headlines spread: "Frequent ejaculation lowers prostate cancer risk." For some, it was liberation. For others, disbelief. After all, how could something once shrouded in guilt and secrecy turn out to be a prescription for health? Doctors now had hard evidence. Instead of dodging awkward questions with vague answers, they could point to one of the most rigorous studies ever conducted. And patients, especially those anxious about prostate cancer, finally had clarity. Their bodies were not betraying them. For men, this wasn't just a medical discovery, it was a cultural earthquake. Myths that had persisted for centuries crumbled in a single dataset. Fear gave way to empowerment. Silence gave way to laughter, even relief. But one question still lingered. Why? How could something so simple, so natural, provide such a shield against one of the deadliest cancers in men? The answer would lead to an even deeper understanding of the body's quiet wisdom. For centuries, the body's quiet intelligence was overlooked, buried beneath superstition. But once the Harvard study revealed the link between frequent ejaculation and lower prostate cancer risk, scientists began asking a deeper question: what exactly is happening inside the body? The prostate is not just another organ, it is a small but vital gland. Sitting just below the bladder, wrapping around the urethra like a watchful guard. Its main role is to produce the fluid that nourishes and protects sperm. But here's the truth that often goes unspoken. That fluid can build up. When it does, it carries with it not only nutrients, but also potential toxins, cellular debris, and carcinogens. Think of it like a reservoir. If the water flows regularly, it stays fresh, clear, life-giving. But if it stagnates, it becomes cloudy, vulnerable to decay. The same principle applies to the prostate. Regular ejaculation clears the system, flushing out old fluids and replacing them with new. It's a biological cleansing, a renewal process nature built into the male body. Researchers believe this flushing effect helps prevent the accumulation of harmful substances that might trigger DNA damage in prostate cells. In other words, ejaculation acts like a maintenance routine, keeping the gland healthier, reducing inflammation, and lowering the chance that rogue cells can take root and multiply. But it doesn't stop there. Ejaculation may also reduce the concentration of certain proteins linked to cancer growth. Some studies suggest it balances hormones, decreasing exposure to excessive testosterone and its byproducts, which are known to fuel prostate cancer. And perhaps most intriguingly, it promotes circulation. Each release sends a surge of blood flow, oxygen, and nutrients through the region, almost like exercise for the gland itself. What movement does for muscles, ejaculation seems to do for the prostate. It keeps the tissue active, refreshed, alive. Suddenly, what was once whispered as sinful or dangerous reveals itself as nature's quiet wisdom. The body had always known. It wasn't about weakness, nor about indulgence. It was about balance, health, and renewal. For men, this understanding offered something even greater than prevention. It reframed intimacy, not as a guilty secret, but as a gift of biology, a rhythm the body depends on. And yet, as powerful as this discovery was, it was only the beginning. Because the next revelation wasn't just about men's health, it was about human relationships, intimacy, and the very way society talks about sex. For centuries, men lived under the shadow of silence. Desire was something to be hidden, joked about, or condemned. Fathers rarely spoke of it to sons. Doctors often sidestepped it with vague warnings. Religion, culture, and tradition all cast their weight upon it, shaping generations of shame. But when the Harvard study made headlines, the silence began to crack. Suddenly, a taboo subject was being discussed in medical journals, news articles, even dinner table conversations. Men who once kept their worries locked away found themselves with permission to ask new questions. What does this mean for me, for my marriage, for my health? The discovery didn't just free the body, began to free the mind. By showing that something natural could be protective rather than harmful, it lifted a burden of guilt that many men had carried since adolescence. Those whispers of weakness, those warnings of danger, began to sound hollow, outdated, almost absurd in the light of science. Doctors, too, changed. Once reluctant to touch the subject, many began speaking openly with patients. Prostate cancer wasn't just about genetics, diet, or age anymore. It was also about intimacy, rhythm, and release. A subject once avoided became a vital part of preventive health conversations. And there was another ripple effect: relationships. Couples who had long struggled with mismatched expectations, with the tension between desire and restraint, suddenly found a new lens. Intimacy wasn't just emotionally, was also protective, life-giving, essential. For some, this knowledge softened old conflicts. For others, it deepened connection. Of course, not everyone embraced the change. For many, the old beliefs ran too deep. Cultural traditions don't dissolve overnight. Some still held to the idea that restraint was purity, that frequent intimacy was excess. But for millions of men and their partners, the conversation had shifted forever. For the first time in history, science gave men something they had never truly possessed before: the right to see their own biology as ally, not enemy. The prostate was no longer a ticking time bomb or a source of silent fear. It was a part of the body with its own rhythm, its own wisdom, deserving of care and understanding. And so, a new narrative began to emerge, not just about cancer, but about life, love, and the dignity of embracing the truth of our bodies. The story of ejaculation and prostate health might seem narrow at first glance, a curiosity tucked away in the world of men's medicine. But in truth, It belongs to something far larger. The story of how we understand our bodies, our habits, and the quiet interplay between biology and culture. Think about it. For decades, medical research has often separated the physical from the emotional, the mechanical from the intimate. We measured cholesterol, blood sugar, blood pressure, but left unspoken the rhythms of desire, the hidden cycles of pleasure and release. The Harvard study forced a merging of those worlds. Suddenly, what happened in the privacy of one's body carried weight in the halls of science. And this was not the first time such a shift had occurred. History is filled with moments when something once dismissed as trivial or taboo became recognized as vital. For centuries, sleep was seen as wasted time until science revealed it as essential for memory, immunity, even survival. Laughter, once brushed off as mere amusement, is now understood to lower blood pressure and reduce stress hormones. In the same way, ejaculation moved from the realm of secrecy into the realm of public health. This shift is powerful because it breaks down walls. It reminds us that health is not only about what we eat, how we exercise, or what medicines we take. It is also about what we carry in silence, what we allow ourselves to feel, and how we treat the most intimate rhythms of our lives. Beyond the prostate. This knowledge became a metaphor. It whispered that sometimes the things we fear most are not threats at all, but gifts misunderstood. It showed that science can be not just a tool of cold measurement, but also a torch that lights up the hidden corners of human experience. For men who had grown up in silence, this was more than data was, liberation. For women, it was a window into understanding the men in their lives with greater compassion. And for doctors, it was a lesson in humility, that the body still holds secrets. And sometimes, the answers are far simpler, more natural, than we ever expect. So, while the study began with the prostate, its echo reached much further. It became part of a new wave of medicine, one that dares to ask uncomfortable questions, that seeks truth even in taboo places. And that values the human experience as much as the laboratory result. In that sense, the lesson of ejaculation and prostate cancer is not just about cancer at all. It is about courage, the courage to question, to study, and to listen to the body when society tells us not to. The Harvard findings were groundbreaking, yes, but they were never meant to be a silver bullet. Science, after all, rarely works in isolation. Health is a puzzle, one built of many pieces, and ejaculation was revealed to be only one of them. To understand the full picture, we have to step back and look at the other forces that shape the life of the prostate. Diet, for instance, is one of the quiet giants of men's health. Across cultures, patterns emerge. In Mediterranean countries, where olive oil, tomatoes, and fresh vegetables dominate the table, prostate cancer rates are lower. Lycopene, the red pigment found in tomatoes and watermelon, has been studied for its antioxidant properties, protecting cells from the silent damage of free radicals. Meanwhile, men in Japan, long accustomed to green tea and fish rich in omega-3 south, show lower risks compared to Western populations. These are not coincidences. They are dietary fingerprints etched into the biology of health. Exercise, too, writes its story on the body. A man who moves, who walks, lifts, sweats tends to carry less visceral fat. The deep fat that fuels inflammation and hormonal imbalances. Studies show that regular physical activity not only keeps weight in check, but also supports healthier testosterone levels, a key factor in prostate well-being. Even 30 minutes of brisk walking most days is enough to tilt the balance. And then there are the habits we know but often ignore. Smoking, alcohol, late-night stress. each one carries a cost. Tobacco in particular is a thief. It steals oxygen from tissues, damages blood vessels, and multiplies the risks of aggressive cancer. Alcohol, in excess, inflames the liver and disturbs the delicate hormonal dance that influences the prostate. Put all of this together, and a picture emerges. Ejaculation is a cleansing mechanism. Yes, but its power is amplified diminished by the choices a man makes daily. Imagine a toolbox. Ejaculation is one tool, sharp and useful. But without the hammer of diet, the saw of exercise, the nails of good sleep, the work remains unfinished. The structure of health cannot stand on one piece alone. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: the prostate does not exist in isolation. It is not a machine part that fails on its own. It belongs to a living system, one where mind, body, and daily life intersect. When one piece is neglected, the others must work harder. When all are aligned, resilience grows quietly, steadily, almost invisibly, till the years reveal its worth. The Harvard study lit the torch, but it is lifestyle that keeps the flame burning. And in that truth lies both responsibility and hope. Responsibility, because no one can walk the path for us. Hope, because the path is always open, no matter when we begin. As compelling as the Harvard findings were, they never erased a simple truth. Medicine remains the cornerstone of prostate health. For all the stories of diet, exercise, and daily habits, one truth stands unshaken: early detection saves lives. Doctors know this well. The prostate, small as it is, can be unpredictable. In some men, cancers grow slowly, hardly stirring for years. In others, they are swift, aggressive, and silent. That is why medicine insists on vigilance. It is why, after the age of 40 or 50, men are urged to have regular checkups, especially if family history casts a shadow. The PSA test, a simple blood test measuring prostate-specific antigen, is one of the most discussed tools in this fight. It is not perfect. Sometimes it raises alarms where there is no danger. Sometimes it misses cancers that lurk in silence. But paired with physical exams, scans, and modern imaging, it becomes a watchful guardian. For many men, it is the first line of defense, the moment a hidden threat is revealed, before it has the chance to grow. This is where the story of ejaculation and lifestyle merges with medicine. No amount of tomatoes or daily release can replace what a skilled physician can see and interpret. The best outcomes arise when science and self-care walk side by side. A man who tends to his diet, moves his body, and respects the rhythms of intimacy will always be better prepared when he sits across from his doctor. And medicine, too, is evolving. Where once surgery and radiation were blunt instruments, today's tools are refined. Robotic surgery, targeted therapies, immunotherapy all represent a future where treatment is less invasive, less devastating, more precise. Men who once faced the terrifying choice between survival and quality of life now see glimmers of both. But perhaps the greatest role of medicine is not just in curing, but in counseling. The best physicians are not merely technicians, they are guides. They are the ones who help separate myth from fact, fear from truth. They remind patients that a healthy sex life is not indulgence, but part of the body's rhythm. They help men see the prostate not as an enemy, but as a partner to be understood. And so, the role of medicine remains both practical and symbolic. It is the hand on the shoulder, the steady voice that says, "You are not alone in this. There is a way forward." Long before Harvard's data reached the headlines, men lived under the weight of stories, myths whispered in locker rooms, warnings preached from pulpits, and cautionary tales passed down like heirlooms. These weren't born from science. They were born from fear, control, and moral judgment. In Victorian England, for example, physicians warned that masturbation would drain the body's vital energy, leading to blindness, insanity, even early death. Pamphlets circulated with illustrations of pale, sickly youths, presented as cautionary examples of what self-abuse could do. Across the ocean in America, entire industries thrived on this fear. Strange medical devices, chastity belts, electric shock contraptions, and bizarre ointments were sold as cures for what was seen not as a natural act, but as a disease. Religion amplified this fear. In many faith traditions, desire outside of procreation was labeled as sinful, indulgent, or shameful. Sermons warned that giving in to temptation weakened not only the body but also the soul. Young men carried these words like invisible chains, convinced that every private act was a step toward moral ruin. Even in the 20th century, misinformation flourished. Boys were told that frequent ejaculation could shrink their strength, that it would use up sperm and leave them sterile. Others believed it would deform the body or poison the blood. None of it had basis in reality, but the fear was real, shaping generations of men who felt guilty for even the most natural impulses. And then came the rise of the Internet. A tool that promised information also spread new waves of confusion. Forums filled with unverified claims, videos trafficked in fearmongering, and pseudo-experts sold miracle cures for prostate health. For every page of science, there were 10 pages of noise. Against this backdrop, the Harvard study was not just a medical revelation, it was a cultural earthquake. It directly contradicted centuries of fear, saying, "The thing you were told to fear may, in fact, protect you." Imagine the shock of that truth. Imagine the relief of men who had carried shame since boyhood, finally learning that their bodies were not betraying them, but guarding them. This is why myths matter. They are not harmless stories. They shape how people live, how they love, how they suffer in silence. And when misinformation reigns, science has the power not just to heal the body, but to liberate the mind. Science speaks in numbers, in charts and percentages, but behind every statistic is a face, a life, a story. To truly understand the impact of the Harvard findings, we must step into the shoes of the men who lived under old fears and those who found freedom in new knowledge. Take Thomas, for instance, a quiet man in his 60s. He grew up in a small Midwestern town where the subject of sex was never spoken. His father's only advice had been a muttered warning: "Don't touch yourself, it will ruin you." Thomas carried those words like stones in his pocket. Even as an adult, he could not shake the guilt. Every time he felt desire, shame followed close behind. When he read about the Harvard study, he sat in silence for a long time. Then, he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because decades of fear suddenly felt absurd. "I wasted half my life believing I was broken," he later told his wife. "Turns out, I was healthier than I thought." Or consider Raphael, a younger man in his 40s. His father died of prostate cancer at 58, and ever since, Raphael lived with quiet dread. He monitored every symptom, every twinge, convinced that he was next. When his doctor explained the study, it shifted something inside him. For the first time, he realized his health wasn't just a matter of fight it, was something he could influence. It didn't erase his risk, but it gave him a sense of control, a way to act rather than simply wait. And then there is Michael and Anna, a married couple who spent years arguing over mismatched desires. Anna often felt rejected, while Michael wrestled with guilt. worried that too much intimacy might damage his health. When they discovered together that the opposite might be truth, that their closeness was not only safe, but potentially protective, it softened something between them. Intimacy became not just pleasure but reassurance, a shared act of love with health woven quietly into it. These stories are not isolated. They ripple across continents and cultures. Men who once avoided doctors now walk into clinics with questions. Couples who lived in silence now talk openly. Sons who grew up with warnings now grow up with knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, these personal stories remind us that science is not cold. It is not distant. It reaches into the quiet corners of people's lives, lifting burdens we sometimes forget we carry. For Thomas, Raphael, Michael, and millions of others, the Harvard study was not just a headline. It was a key, unlocking a door to freedom, dignity, and the right to trust one's own body. Freedom without guidance can become another trap. After the Harvard study's results began to spread, some were quick to declare it a license and excuse to indulge without thought. But science, when misunderstood, can be as dangerous as myth. The truth was never that daily release was a miracle cure. The truth was balance. Ejaculation, like diet or exercise, is one thread in a much larger tapestry. Yes, it may lower risk. Yes, it may help the body cleanse and renew. But no single act, no matter how consistent, can replace the complexity of health. A man who clings to this one habit while ignoring the rest, who smokes, eats poorly, avoids doctors, still carries risks. The study did not erase responsibility. It reframed it. Consider it like tending a garden. Water alone will not bring life. The soil must be cared for, weeds pulled, sunlight allowed. Ejaculation is the water essential, refreshing, but without the other elements, the garden withers. Balance is the only true path. And balance means more than just frequency. It means understanding the emotional and relational weight of intimacy. For some men, the study became a chance to connect more deeply with partners, to see sex not only as pleasure but as health. For others, it became a reason to free themselves from shame. But in all cases, the lesson was the same. Health is never just physical. It is woven into the choices we make daily, into the way we honor ourselves and those we love. There is also responsibility to truth. The internet, quick to sensationalize, often twisted the findings into headlines like "More sex prevents cancer." But science does not speak in absolutes. It speaks in probabilities, in correlations, in careful measures of risk and protection. The Harvard team themselves cautioned that their study was not a prescription, but an insight, a window into how the body may protect itself. So, responsibility is double-edged. Responsibility to the body, to care for it in all the ways it requires. And responsibility to the truth, to avoid bending science into myth once more. Because myths are not only born from fear, they can also be born from wishful thinking. Balance is the answer. The freedom the study gave was not permission to abandon wisdom. It was an invitation to live wisely, fully, and without unnecessary shame. In the end, the healthiest life is not about chasing extremes, but about finding rhythm, the quiet, steady beat of choices made with care. Health is never lived in isolation. It is filtered through culture, belief, and tradition. What the Harvard study revealed in Boston did not stay confined to the halls of academia. It traveled, translated, and collided with worldviews across the globe. In Japan, for instance, the findings resonated with a culture that already embraced holistic health. There, green tea, fish, and soy-rich diets have long been linked to lower prostate cancer rates. When Japanese media reported the Harvard study, Many saw it as confirmation that balance between diet, intimacy, and daily life was the true key. The result was less shock, more affirmation. Contrast this with parts of the Middle East, where discussions of sexuality remain tightly bound by religious and cultural norms. In such places, the idea that frequent ejaculation could be protective against cancer was controversial. For some, it was quietly welcomed, a private truth passed between men. For others, it clashed with centuries of moral teaching. The conversation was whispered, not shouted. In Europe, reactions were more varied. Scandinavian countries, already known for open conversations about sexuality, integrated the findings easily into public health discussions. Clinics spoke of prostate health without hesitation, linking it to mental well-being and intimacy. In contrast, in more conservative corners of Eastern Europe, the study was acknowledged medically, but often stripped of its cultural implications. The science was accepted, but the conversation stayed clinical, detached from everyday life. And then there is Africa, where prostate cancer rates are high and often diagnosed late. For men there, the Harvard findings offered hope, but also frustration. Knowledge alone is not enough without access to regular screening and care. In many regions, cultural silence around sexuality and the scarcity of medical resources still pose greater barriers than myths. The study became a beacon, but one shining at a distance. What this global journey shows us is that science is not just science. It is also story. A fact in one culture becomes liberation. The same fact in another becomes controversy. And in some places, it remains a luxury, an idea, without the infrastructure to turn knowledge into action. Yet, despite the differences, one thread runs through them all: the human longing to understand the body without shame. Whether whispered in a Cairo cafe, discussed openly in a Stockholm clinic, or shared privately in a rural African village, the Harvard findings planted a seed of possibility that health and intimacy, once thought to be at odds, might actually be allies. In this way, the study did more than reduce risk percentages. It bridged cultures. It reminded humanity that beneath language, religion, and custom, the body speaks the same truth. The Harvard study was not an ending. It was a doorway. One that opened into a vast hallway of unanswered questions. For if ejaculation could influence prostate cancer risk, what else might daily habits silently shape? And what more could science uncover, if given time, funding, and courage? Already, researchers are looking deeper beyond frequency and into mechanism. How exactly does ejaculation clear carcinogens from the prostate? Is it simply a matter of flushing the system, or does it influence hormones, immune cells, even the genetic switches that govern tumor growth? These are not abstract curiosities. They are the difference between prevention and cure. Some studies are exploring the role of inflammation. Chronic inflammation, after all, is a known driver of many cancers. Could regular release reduce the simmering fires inside the prostate, keeping the tissue calmer, healthier, less prone to mutation? Others are studying how sexual health intersects with mental health. Depression and anxiety are known to weaken the body's defenses. Could intimacy, whether shared or solo, act as a shield not only physical, but psychological? Technology, too, promises answers. With advances in imaging, researchers can now observe the prostate in ways unimaginable 2 decades ago. Machine learning can scan thousands of patient records, finding patterns no human eye could detect. Genomics can reveal which men benefit most from frequent release, and which may require other forms of protection. Science is no longer limited to one study, one group, one culture. It is global, interconnected, accelerating, but the future of research also depends on courage. For while the Harvard study cracked open a taboo, many doors remain closed. Funding for sexual health research is still scarce. Stigma still lingers. Too often, men suffer in silence, their health left vulnerable because culture deems the topic unfit for open discussion. Without breaking this silence, progress risks being stalled. And yet, there is reason for hope. Younger generations are less bound by shame, more open to speaking about intimacy and health in the same breath. Medical schools are training doctors to treat the whole person, not just the disease. Public health campaigns are learning to weave science into story, ensuring knowledge spreads beyond journals into the lives of everyday men. The future, then, is not about repeating the Harvard study, it is about expanding it. About moving from frequency charts to holistic health, from whispered confessions to public conversations, about ensuring that no man, whether in Boston, Nairobi, or Hanoi, faces prostate cancer without knowledge, support, and choice. Science does not stand still, and neither does the story of men's health. The next chapter is already being written, one discovery, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. When I first read the Harvard study, I didn't see numbers on a chart. I saw faces. The faces of men I knew, friends, family, mentors, men who carried both pride and silence when it came to their health. Some had spoken of aches they ignored, of screenings they avoided, of conversations they felt too embarrassed to have. Others had already walked the shadowed path of diagnosis, their lives split into before and after. And I wondered how many of them might have lived differently if they had known this truth earlier. How many of them might have felt freer, lighter, less burdened by shame. For the study was not just about lowering risk, it was about giving men permission to listen to their bodies without guilt. For me, the lesson became clear. Science is not distant. It is personal. It touches the quietest corners of our lives. The habits we form, the fears we carry, the stories we inherit, they all shape the body in ways seen and unseen. The Harvard study simply pulled back the curtain on one of those hidden links. But it reminded me of something larger. That our health is built, day by day, in choices both small and great. I thought, too, of the younger men, those growing up in a world still filled with mixed messages. To them, the study might become a lifeline, a way to reconcile curiosity with care, desire with health. And I hoped they would not carry the weight of silence as heavily as generations before them did. Most of all, I reflected on the gift of honesty. Talking about prostate health is not easy. It forces us to face vulnerability, mortality, even intimacy itself. But what greater act of courage is there than to face truth directly? To look at the body, not with shame, but with respect. I realized then that this story was never just about cancer prevention. It was about liberation, about reclaiming the right to speak openly, to act wisely, to live fully. For every statistic carries a human life behind it, a father, a brother, a friend. And when science reaches into that space, when it gives us tools to protect what we love, it becomes more than research. It becomes hope. Every culture has its myths. Some are born from fear, others from hope. For centuries, myths about male desire carried chains of guilt, silence, and shame. Men were told their bodies were dangerous, their urges destructive. And in that silence, many suffered alone. Then came the Harvard study. It did not arrive as a myth, but as data, numbers, correlations, clinical evidence. And yet, beneath the charts and graphs, it whispered something far more human. Your body is not your enemy. What once was condemned as weakness could, in truth, be part of strength. What once was shrouded in taboo could be understood as care. This reframing is where healing begins. Because healing is not only about treating illness, it is about restoring dignity. When men learn that their health is tied not to suppression but to balance, a weight lifts, shame dissolves, and in its place grows a new story. One of acceptance, responsibility, and freedom. The healing narrative does not erase the risks of cancer. It does not promise immunity. But it gives men a language to speak of their health without fear. It gives partners a way to understand intimacy as more than pleasure, something woven into survival itself. It gives doctors a bridge, a way to connect science with humanity. And perhaps, most importantly, it transforms silence into conversation. Around kitchen tables, in doctors' offices, in whispered confessions between fathers and sons, the narrative spreads that caring for one's body is not shameful, but sacred. That acknowledging vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. The healing is generational. For when one man dares to speak, others listen. Sons learn from fathers, partners learn from each other, friends share truths once hidden. Slowly, the chains of myth give way to a circle of trust. And in that circle, men no longer carry their burdens alone. The Harvard study began as science, but its legacy is story. A story that heals not only the body, but the soul. For in knowing the truth, men gain not just years, but the freedom to live those years fully, openly, and without shame. So now, after all the myths, all the fears, and all the whispers passed down through generations, what do we truly know? We know that the prostate, that small walnut-sized gland so often overlooked, carries enormous weight in a man's health. We know that the fears surrounding daily release were born not from science, but from silence, from moral warnings disguised as health advice. And we know, thanks to decades of research and one landmark study at Harvard, that the truth is the opposite of what so many believed. Daily release, whether through intimacy with a partner or through solitary moments, is not a danger. It may, in fact, be one of the simplest, most natural allies in the lifelong struggle to keep the prostate healthy. Science now shows us what myth tried to obscure: that the body, when cared for with respect and balance, carries within it the tools of its own defense. But here is where the story returns to you. Because no study, no data, no discovery is meaningful unless it changes how we live. The call is not to obsession, not to reckless pursuit of one act as a cure-all, but to awareness. To see the body as a whole system, where diet, exercise, rest, intimacy, and regular medical checkups form a web of protection stronger than any single thread. This is your invitation to treat your health as sacred, to refuse the silence that has trapped men for generations, to speak openly and act courageously. The myths end here, with us, and in their place grows a new story, one of science, truth, and hope. So the next time the question rises late at night, in private thought, or in conversation with someone you trust, remember this: the truth is not fearful, it is freeing. What you do with it is your power, your responsibility, your gift. Stay curious, stay courageous, and above all, stay alive.